Welcome very much from my side as well to all the audience across Europe. And Tanya, you've provided a really good overview about what's happening today and also how it connects to yesterday. Yesterday we started off hearing a little bit about all the lessons that we can learn as civic society in terms of how to use actually also the dynamics that such a pandemic actually creates, especially the role that arts and culture plays in this as well. It came around very quickly that it was really about creating protected spaces for civic society to actually take agency and to fill those spaces there as well. We've heard from Maya Gopal and von Grace again about agency and the way of how important it is for the people to be really in. It's a part of co-creation, give people perspective and give people a purpose in this around as well. So today the main focus will be about the European Union's Green Deal and the impacts and consequences for the rest of the world, especially from a Global South perspective. We've invited three very interesting speakers from providing various perspectives. Let me introduce them. The first one is Professor Imme Scholz. Imme Scholz is the Deputy Chairwoman of the German Council for Sustainable Development and the Acting Director of the German Development Institute, sitting in Bonn. We have Rukiya Khamis from Kenya. Rukiya is a climate and social activist representing 350.org, and she's organizing grassroots communities in the Anglophone African countries. And on top of that, she's very, very passionate about water conservation and mitigation of water-related conflicts. And finally, we have Sven Egenter joining us from Berlin. He's heading up the Clean Energy Wire and Klimafakten.de, a foundation-based outfit that is really focusing and providing information on energy transition and makes it very available to journalists and the broader public. Sven has a long career in journalism across Europe. Very welcome. Do we see Rukiya already as well, or I can't, now we see her. Hello, Rukiya, welcome to Kenya. Yeah? The format of our talk will be that Imme Scholz will provide a short overview, share her insights into the European Green New Deal, and then we would get a perspective from Rukiya. How's it being perceived from the Global South? Yeah, how does somebody from Africa looks at it, and how real is this really? Is this just one more initiative, or is that something which is really tangible and promising from your side? And then finally, we would hear also the comments from Sven Egenter in terms of what does it also mean from a general public perspective. How can we actually take this forward and create stories and strong narratives around it there in providing the facts, but also reaching people to make this really meaningful. Like yesterday, we will be using Slido on the main webpage in terms of collecting your questions and comments around it there. So please feel free to share them as soon as possible around them, and then we will have them directed to the relevant person, or actually get three perspectives on the same question as you post them around. I'm looking forward to a really interesting debate, and may I pass it over to Imme Scholz to share your insights and your perspectives on the European Union's deal.
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. I hope you can hear me well. So, yes, the European Green Deal was announced by the Commission at the Climate COP at the end of last year in Madrid. And I think the excitement then was great because it was very clear on how to ramp up the EU's ambition regarding emission reductions and achieving climate neutrality by 2050, but also because it went a step further and didn't focus only on climate neutrality, but it included other goals for reducing negative environmental trends in the EU. So it wants to invest in circular economy, so to decouple economic activity or economic growth from resource use. It wants to do more for biodiversity protection, and is in particular to reduce the environmental harms connected with agriculture and food consumption. So that it sounded somehow convincing as a European strategy for not only implementing the Paris Agreement, but also the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. And the EU was lacking such a strategic approach by that time. Since then, or let's say, so the aim of the European Green Deal is to achieve structural change towards sustainability within the EU, but also to give a push to international processes to ensure that other countries follow. And I think the most immediate success which has been achieved there in terms of climate policy is the announcement by the Chinese head of state Xi Jinping to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 and go beyond the national contributions which China had submitted to the COP until now. And in that sense, from the perspective of the Global South, it's also important to see that the European Commission said the Green Deal should be at the center of its renewed partnership with Africa and with the African Union. It should be the basis for having green alliances with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Asia and the Pacific. So renew its international cooperation with these groups of countries. It should also be part of their cooperation with the neighborhood of the European Union in Eastern Europe and in the South, so Northern Africa and Middle East. And it will also form the basis of European states in the G20 and their talks on emission reductions there. And the G20, as you know, is not only gathering the major economies from the old West, so to say, but also large emerging economies from all other continents. And together they cover 80% of everything, 80% of world's population, 80% of world's GDP, 80% of world's emissions and other environmental problems, so to say. So now, obviously, the corona pandemic has changed things, and massively in the EU too, because it's here where countries and societies really have big problems in containing the pandemic, more problems than Asian countries, for example, or African countries, it seems. So what the EU did then was to connect the European Green Deal with its COVID-19 recovery investments. And it expects countries which have been hit by the pandemic and which need this solidarity by other European Union members to connect their recovery measures and investment projects with implementing the European Green. And that is a positive sign too. Now, what are the negative aspects, or what is the critical approach to the European Green Deal? And I want to underline, it's a critical approach with the interest of protecting the Green Deal and really implementing it, achieving it. Yeah. So the criticism now is to the usual dynamics, which we always see. The European Commission makes a proposal and then member states aren't satisfied. And what we can observe is that member states are more interested in reducing financial engagement by the Commission as such, so the reduced spending and focusing on changes within Europe and reducing spending for international cooperation. That's negative because the European single market is the largest market of the world, and it is very likely that if the European Union makes advances in greening its production and consumption, this has effects on global value chains, and this has effects on the competitiveness of European products with other countries where these green change processes are not so advanced, which means that the European Union might adopt carbon adjustment measures at its borders, which then could negatively affect exports, especially from developing countries where no such public and private resources are available for this a swift green restructuring. So the European Union has to make sure that the measures it adopts to protect its own greening strategy does not go to the detriment of least developed countries or low-income countries. So it should exempt those countries from such carbon border adjustments. On the other hand, of course, these greening measures also attached to imports, they can be a support for a green transformation in exporting countries. But for ensuring this, the EU also has to make sure that it does not only talk about these requirements, but also put controls, efficient control and effective controls in place to make sure that its imports, for example, from Latin America do not contribute to deforestation, but help to avoid it. That's one point. And the other point is that not all member states are sharing the urge of the European Commission in transforming towards sustainability. We have seen this in the very lukewarm approach to reforms of the common agricultural policy, which certainly are not sufficient for making food systems sustainable. So all in all, I think that the European Green Deal started as a big promise, but now seeing its steps which are being taken for implementing it, for adopting it in the first place, it's still not being adopted, as the European Parliament is also making more requests on making it sharper. It's really important that negative spillovers of the European Green Deal for developing countries are avoided. And on the other hand, positive spillovers, stimulating spillover effects that help developing countries transform their economies, the two are strengthened. So this is, again, we are in this dynamic between the Commission and the Council and member states, and I hope that that those countries which have heavily invested in the Paris Agreement and in the 2030 agenda keep the momentum up and find a constructive solution for the adoption process. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Imme Scholz, for this view, your insights, and also give us a balanced assessment of actually also where the critical areas are. I would like to pass the microphone or the Zoom window over to Rukiya now, to Kenya, and would be really interested in what is actually your perspective on this. This is probably not the first new deal or new initiative that you've seen, and you have your own experiences around it there. What is the atmosphere? What is the vibes from the Global South towards this? Is this something for real? Are there real hopes in it? Or is that something where you look at it very, very cautiously?
Thank you so much, Doug. This is a very interesting conversation, and thank you, Imme Scholz, for your comments on it. So first of all, I'd like to say that the Green Deal is surely very ambitious. We'd like to acknowledge that part. And also bring forth that Africa as a continent is amongst the least contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions globally, and least contributor to the climate change crisis. But also acknowledging that our continents are not silos at the moment. I think the pandemic, unfortunately, has kind of brought that kind of perspective to light, how although we're 1,000 miles away, whatever affects one continent can affect us all, and this is where we're at. And this comes to something as this policy, this Green Deal policy that's coming up. How does this impact Africa as a continent and also the Global South as a region? So when I'm thinking about just let's start with just trade, because this is also going to be affecting a lot of what the fossil fuel industry is the biggest contributor to the climate change crisis, to the climate crisis, sorry. And all this also comes in with trade and economics of it. So the largest export and import partner for Africa is the EU. And we need to acknowledge that how does that affect our trade, and how do we work with each other? And to be honest, I like the parts around around the trade agreements and the partnerships and strategic partnerships with Africa and other continents of the Global South, trying to embed this into the just transition angle. What I can say is there should be resistance expected to this Green Deal. I think the US did the Green New Deal. Now the EU is bringing up the Green Deal, which is good, but curious to see how much consultation was it done with these African partners or these African country partners for that Green Deal before it was passed as something that should be taken up? And then also, since we're expecting that the African country, the continent will be part of the bandwagon, but a large part of some of the countries are still dependent on fossil fuels and are still not into the circular economy perspective. And this is where organizers and campaigners as myself are coming in to try and bring the narrative around the just transition, just recovery, but it's a very long way to that. For example, Nigeria right now, we're running like a campaign around the Coal-Free Nigeria campaign, but we are acknowledging that we won't get Nigeria from stopping to use coal at this moment. All the least we can do is try to maybe reduce the amount of licenses that go into coal, allowing mines and coal plants to be set up in Nigeria, and start from stopping new investments, and then going to stopping the current ones that are existing. So coming down to Kenya, with the decolonized movement around the coal plant, which was supposed to be set up in a World Heritage site like Lamu. This is something that the government is pushing for really quickly and really strongly, but how does that affect not only trade, but also just the conversations around in Kenya as well? So this is something that's happening. It's amazing that there's this ambition from outside the continent, but for us in Africa, we're really trying as much as we can to really build that momentum from the inside out. So pushing, like what Imme Scholz said about the Paris Agreement, that's the governing kind of principle we are using right now. And all our governments are having this Vision 2030 around that. And that's our main priority. How can we achieve as much as we can before the 2030? Ghana's trying to get to 30% RE by 2030. And also Nigeria's trying to stop new coal plants. Kenya's trying to stop coal plants from happening in their countries. So there's so much happening in Africa. So this is just another new policy that they need to think about, another new strategic partnership they need to think about as well. And then for campaigning or organizing, now we're thinking, how can we use the Green Deal to help us, to support us in pushing the agenda around just recovery and just transition? And so far, whenever we use in the continent, we use policies from the international perspective. We're normally told, you guys have been paid by the international communities to come speak around these things, or we'll be told, you guys are anti-development. Europe, US have developed because of coal plants and coal mines and oil and gas. Now, why are you coming in to tell us, Africa, we can't take that up? That's the kind of narrative. That's the kind of feedback we get as campaigners in Africa when we bring these issues forward. So it's ambitious, yet it's a great step forward, since the global north is the highest contributor to the greenhouse gas emission. So obviously we're looking to say, this is happening in the global north. How can we use that to really bring that narrative down to the African countries as well? And I guess in terms of when I say stopping or just mitigating or just stopping the fossil fuel infrastructures happening in Africa, the one thing that has been helpful is using finance and economy in terms of in narrative, because no people in the economic want to hear, it will save the environment. They're like, how is it going to help our pockets? So they don't care about the environment, to be honest. So when banks like the European Investment Bank came up and said they're going to be funding also circular economy investments, that was a really good thing for the African continent, because now we could say, okay, you guys are pushing for fossil fuel projects and whatnots, but the people who actually have developed from that are actually stepping out. So why us as Africa, with diverse biodiversity, diverse culture, still pushing for this narrative? So yes, 100%, it's a good initiative from Europe, and maybe the best way. And I'm speaking around the implementation perspective that Imme Scholz brought up, it's a big issue. We always have these amazing policies, but we never implement them. So how can we really implement them and make them work for everyone? And it seems like we really have to have a tough hand to make sure that everyone's on board to come in. And we were thinking around just the the Kyoto Protocol, having protocols like that. What if we made such deals into protocols that anyone who signed on to such spaces have to really stop producing or funding fossil fuel industries in their countries? So maybe that could help in implementation to really force their hand to really pick people over profit, because as the years go, it seems like profit is first and people are second, and we really need to change that narrative. So yeah, thank you, Doc.
Thanks so much, Rukiya, for sharing those perspectives. Yeah, seeing it's really with a good intention and might be a really good thing. But again, it's a lot of things are actually there, but then the big step is actually going for implementation. And I'm sure we will come back to that point during our discussion part around it there. The second big part that you mentioned, Rukiya, is actually how it's being framed and what kind of narrative is created around it there, and how people are being put in boxes or how they're being labeled around it there. And I think that's something probably Sven is very familiar with as well. What are your takes on this before we coming back to an overall discussion?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning again to all the NICE participants whom I unfortunately cannot see, but I hope there are a lot of those out there interested. Good morning from Berlin. Thank you, Dirk, for the introduction. And in particular, thank you, Rukiya and Imme, for the very thorough presentation analysis, actually, of what the Green Deal is and could mean. Dirk, you mentioned it, the question really is this a top policy level decision that will never, trickle down into reality, or is there something more to that? And I would briefly zoom back, basically, fittingly on Zoom, to where we were in 2019, early 2019, and to show how remarkable that this Green Deal actually is. We at the Clean Energy Wire have been covering energy transition stories for the last 6 years, daily, every day, you get our newsletter. And in the run-up to the EU election in 2019, the big question was, would the populist right capture Europe? And would they basically wreck the basis for what some would call progressive policies? And then, we got a sort of mini green wave, as some have called it, in the election. We got a surprisingly, setup of the parliament. We got a totally unexpected president of the EU Commission, and we got, I would say, a totally unexpected Green Deal. And I would stress how remarkable that is, given the expectations that, or the fears that were around before. And now we get a deal that has not only relatively ambitious climate goals enshrined, or will enshrine them. It has a social component. It has components of fair transition. It tries to achieve EU leadership, also take on responsibility. I think Rukiya was very right in mentioning that the global north, as it's called, has a responsibility as the part of the world that has driven climate change for so long. So all this is enshrined now in this package. That is really remarkable, and it does trickle down to the member states. I want to strike this positive note before I come to all these things that might be difficult, also the public opinion and public perception sphere, because you have now countries that maybe 2 years ago would not have talked about exiting coal, are now putting coal exits on the table. I'm thinking of Poland. Now, I know that climate campaigners would always say it's too late, it's too little, it's only words, but it's remarkable, that shift. And I think this Green Deal package, basically enshrines a lot of that. And why did it happen? It did happen because there is a broad change in public awareness, at least in many European countries, that climate change is really the defining risk for our societies going forward, and the question how we handle it will define future policies and livelihoods in many places. So that's the sort of positive background. Poll after poll shows, even now in times of COVID, that the public is very well aware of the risks that climate change pose, and they basically favor more decisive action. Now comes the second part. What does that mean? And Rukiya has mentioned it, and Imme has mentioned it, and it's the same story in the EU always. There is a great top-line announcement, a lot of sort of ambition, and then we're getting down to the details, and the devil always is in the details, and that's certainly true for the EU. And if you look at the work package that the Green Deal actually is. And the discussions that we've seen, and Imme mentioned them, already, where some countries are lukewarm at best about, some of the measures. And interestingly, different countries are lukewarm about different things. That makes it always so difficult. Also, although it's also always a chance to get stuff done, because you can balance the lukewarmness basically across all policy fields. But that is obviously a big issue. And the thing is, and that brings me back to this conference and civic education. Also, my job as a journalist and media, there's a lot of attention to the top line discussions. Leaders meeting, discussing things, setting target. Will it be this target? Will it be that target? And then it gets to the implementation phase, and then it's all national politics again. And the attention sort of like falls off, because it's about details. It's about enshrining things in national laws and making them happen on the ground. And there are really big things coming up. And we've seen that, by the way, with agricultural policy, that it almost, the decision, when it came to the details, Greta Thunberg, I think, criticized it. I think it was a bit harsh on all the media, but she noted quite correctly that there wasn't the scrutiny and the interest that probably such a package would have deserved in the media and in the public sphere in the wider sense. And that's not only due to COVID. And there are a lot of very tricky things coming up. And I want to refer again to what Rukiya said. And I think it's really important. One element, for instance, that's coming up next year is the taxonomy for green finance. The EU wants to agree. And that is highly technical. It's something a lot of people have never heard of. It's one of the biggest stories a lot of people have never heard of, because if that's set correctly and right, that could really shift the trillions, because that, exactly as Rukiya said, will prevent, big investors from investing in unsustainable investments. If it's set correctly. If it's set wrongly, it could do exactly the opposite and sort of lock in investments for decades, actually, in unsustainable investments. And you have other elements of the Green Deal, like Imme mentioned it in passing, the carbon adjustment mechanism, carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is meant to basically sort of make sure that, if companies in Europe produce stricter climate goals and guidelines on carbon emissions, that they don't have an incentive to just go abroad and produce then elsewhere to lower standards. Now that sounds always great, and if it again, it could work well, but if it's that badly, and we know that from other EU policies, it could be a perfect measure for protectionism, where you just lock out every import from the global south or any other competing country. So that all requires a lot of scrutiny, and from journalists, first of all, but also from the broader public. I mean, we need to stay on these issues, and it's not something you can always blame Brussels on or blame the lobbyists on. I mean, we need to make the contribution, and we have to watch what's going on. And actually, the EU, I did a little bit of surfing on their website recently. They're not intransparent as some people always claim, at least not the institutions of the EU. You can get down to the lobbyist interventions, at least the formal ones, to their processes and so on, and read what banana growers from Ecuador think about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That there is a lot of things to be looked at. So as I've said, the implementation is key, and what happens in Brussels in these negotiations, but then also on the national level, how this will be implemented, that's still a very open question, requires a lot of scrutiny from the media, but also the broader public. And I think we have a big role to play here. And the third point I want to make, and now that's always, where I feel bad, because this is the sort of like warning sign I want to hold up. I think it's a remarkable deal. I think there are all the opportunities to turn this into a sort of defining policy package that takes leadership, especially as the US is still not clear whether they will return to some sort of positive attitude towards climate action. Although the populace in the US wants that, I mean, the political system doesn't reflect that, obviously. As we just found out again in the election, there was no climate election as a wave that drove that home, even if Biden should clinch that narrow win. The third thing I want to mention, and Rukiya and Imme both also touched on this, we're now in a totally different world than in November 2019 when the Green Deal was announced, because we have a pandemic, a global pandemic, that is absorbing a lot of attention, rightly so, and a lot of money going forward. And the risk is, and there's been a lot of talk about green recovery, which is good, and it shows that the public really is onto this. I think that the pure notion that we are talking actually about green recovery is mostly due to the fact that in many countries, the public in Europe now is pretty aware of the climate crisis and the risks to that. However, we are running the risk that, there's a little bit of green painted on the recovery packages, and they will trump any Green Deal money, in the short run for sure. And then countries will be very tempted to take the money and do measures that lead to a quick economic fix. Now, what is the quick economic fix? It usually is investing in existing infrastructure, in existing companies, in existing jobs. The longer I had a conversation, and we are running now a series of web events for journalists, and we had a conversation with an expert from Greece, and he said, look, if Greece gets money for green recovery, that's fine, but we don't have these projects all sitting in the drawer. What you have sitting in the drawer in many departments of the government is infrastructure spending on roads and on, harbors and all that. And whether they're going to be green, that's a big issue. And the discussion, how you can force basically, member states to invest in green projects, if all they really need to do or want to do now is getting their economies off the brink, basically after a year or whatever it takes of a pandemic, I think that's a big, big question out there and a big risk. And again, will require a lot of attention from the media on the ground in sort of like conversation with Brussels, but also for the public to stay on that, which is really difficult right now as we are all busy with organizing our lives around lockdowns and school closures and more potentially fears about job losses and all that. So to wrap that up, where are we? I think there is a great package out there, that has a remarkable potential. There's the usual risks attached to them, that in the implementation phase, the global south falls sort of like wayside, and all the just transition elements get downgraded, for economic growth reasons. And then there's the exceptional situation that we all don't know how the pandemic will play out, how the public finances will look next year and the year after, and whether that really can, the money for rebuilding the economies can be funneled into sustainable growth, or will end up in the sort of lock-in type of investment. And, I can only call on everybody in this conference, this is civic education, job galore.
Thanks so much, Sven, for sharing those views with us. Yeah, Sven, again, we've heard from all three, it's a huge potential that we have, but there's also a huge risk if we get lost in the battle of the details and it's implemented in a way, it actually has also the potential to lock in the status quo or all the bad things around it there. I'm sure, Imme, in your discussions and in all these circles and councils that you're sitting in, it's nothing new that the member states play a fundamental role, and that also the implementation on a detail level is very important. So probably I would like to hear a few more words from you around this dynamic there. Will it be the same processes as before, or are you actually confident that it will be really taken up? And how you see the current possibilities there, will there be urgency and relevance for those topics in most of the member states? And then I would like to hear from Rukiya afterwards again. From your perspective, you mentioned this inside-out momentum building around it there. It's nice to have that outside opportunity around it there, but what are you doing it from your own community levels around it there? What kind of tools or mechanisms would really enable and empower your communities to actually go and take initiative and actually drive it forward? And then in particular, looking at our audience, we would be really interested in to see what role and what kind of contribution could educators in civic education and all other spaces and the artists and the cultural creators actually provide to this, because it won't be the facts that will drive this debate forward. It's about bringing it closer to the people, it makes people experience this and make it their own story. So, but let's first hear from Imme. How do you see the dynamic with the member states and having a top line that is great, but then losing the battle on the details?
Well, I cannot make a run through the all the 20 plus member states. And I don't know enough, but it is clear that there are many differences between member states. Yeah, so I think the advantage of the European Green Deal and the recovery package and this combination between the two is that it allows for adjusted national strategies. Yeah, and what the EU promises is that it sets aside funding for specific projects which combine recovery with infrastructural investment, for example. Now, that means also that this frees resources in your national budgets for other expenditure which the EU does not support directly, but indirectly, because any funding you get from outside, we know that from development cooperation increases the fungibility of your other resources which you already have in your public budgets. Yeah, so of course you need to have projects prepared. That's true. Yeah. But you need to do that anyway, because all European countries have nationally determined contributions to implementing the Paris Agreement. So there is no way around that. But I agree that the preparedness across the EU probably is different, heterogeneous. Now, this dynamic, what I think is important is to distinguish differences in implementation which are linked to differences in national conditions and differences in political will. Yeah, and I think that is where the political process also centers on. And what our government, the German government, needs to have very clear, so that the conversations and compromises it engages in at European level promote political will and acknowledge national differences. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that this is all going into the wrong direction. I was very disappointed, and colleagues at the Council of Sustainable Development were disappointed at the agreement on the common agricultural policy. That is clearly insufficient, and I don't know enough for knowing when will there be the next political opportunity for looking at that. Probably, I mean, the first 2 years, the next 2 years are supposed to be transition years for making the agricultural subsidies contribute more effectively to greening the food system and the production of it. And probably that should be closely monitored, so that after 1.5 years, we can prepare for a taking stock debate and seeing whether what has been decided is sufficient. So to keep momentum on that. And the same applies to the climate, the implementation of the nationally determined contributions. So I hope we see a next climate COP. I mean, it has been decided next year, and that will be an important moment.
Thanks so much, Imme. And you mentioned one point about all the differences, the cultural differences between the different member states, and that everybody actually needs to understand and accept and embrace those diversities. And that usually leads directly also to the role of educators on building those bridges and a pan-European network like NICE of actually going to provide that awareness, that common understanding and building bridges and not bringing people further apart. So it will be really interesting when our community starts discussing in all the workshops later on today, if we can actually make a contribution towards this. Rukiya, before we come to the audience-fed questions there, I would like to get your view around what kind of mechanisms can you see, or what would be really helpful from your community perspective, from a grassroots perspective, in terms to really use this as an opportunity, as a wonderful potential, and yeah, what would really be helpful from you to drive that inside-out momentum building?
Thank you so much, Doug. So yeah, I guess right now in the continent and I think across the world, we've been seeing that the youth have been taking such a huge forefront in bringing change to the world. And before, we were expecting most of people in power and policy to be really at the forefront of putting our interests. But I'm seeing like the youth are the people right now who are best equipped to occupy spaces and bravely speak forth on conversations that might be uncomfortable in some instances. So in the country right now, there's like a huge hunger for fossil fuel production, investment. Like I mentioned earlier, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Uganda, and Tanzania, with a huge East African crude oil pipeline that's going to be set up right now. And what has been helping us a lot in terms of campaigning and organizing on the ground is using just different tactics to bring these conversations forward. And civic education and creating awareness has been a very important tool, because this means that everyone is at the same level, knowing the same information. Because I think like once the community members and people on the grassroots have the information, they're able to fight for themselves and they get support from the international community. And that's the best way that it should be. Most time people expect that the international community can come help the groups do their work, but actually the grassroots need to be at the forefront, leading the way, and all of us supporting that movement and that conversation around building sustainable energy and communities that are resilient for long and future terms. Then there's the issue of security that has been very rampant for climate and environmental defenders across the continent, and I think globally, mainly even the global south, I think Latin America, Africa, where grassroots communities are putting themselves forth to really speak up against these huge corporations, whether it's like Total or I don't know, like Rio Zim, that are putting up these coal and oil gas projects. What has been helpful is making sure that we are providing civic education in terms of trainings and how to speak in these issues in a nice way. But also, one thing that has been helping is using the finance angle. Because when we use the finance angle, and using targets outside our continent, it's kind of been like an umbrella over those communities. Because if we, for example, for the East African crude oil pipeline, when the campaigners are saying, Total, don't put the East African crude oil pipeline in our country, it's not directly saying President Magufuli or President Museveni do not put the East African crude oil pipeline in our country, which will be more detrimental to the climate defenders if they are targeting the presidents than if they're targeting Total or those international communities outside our space. So that's put up like a good umbrella. And finance tactics like getting big investors like the European Investment Bank, or getting like groups like the Africa Development Bank, saying they're shifting from financing fossil fuels, has really been giving power to these communities, saying if the people who are giving you money are stepping out, then it's making our fight even easier on the ground to make sure that we're able to really have more power to really win sorry, I'm lost my words. To really win this war around this fossil fuel infrastructure in the communities. So I think, like you said, and this is why I really I was honored to be in part of this conversation. Like, we all need to just have information and be educated around these issues, and it impacts all of us in some way, one way or another, somehow. Yeah, thank you, Doc.
Thanks so much, Rukiya. I really like the way how you look at it, and it's so important. It's like what we mentioned before. The devil is in the detail, and when you mention it's about the financial mechanisms that needs understanding and where we can really use the potential from it there. But it's also very complicated, a very technical matter around it there. And how can we prepare civic societies for actually being able to engage on a level field with all the other sides who probably has a lot of very specialized people working on this around it there. What can be done from educators, from journalists, from everybody to actually enable but make the mechanisms transparent and visible and actually empower civic communities and actually to engage this debate on a level playing field? Perhaps, Sven, would you have an answer? I mean, your profession is making information available and accessible to journalists, but perhaps also to wider audiences around. What is really needed now to enable and empower communities to really engage in that debate?
Well, that is a good question, and I would hope that your conference actually provides a lot of fresh ideas on this, and the people out there who work on this subject every day. I mean, we try through for German audience, through our project Klimafakten.de, to give people an idea how to, I mean, first of all, a fact base on what's actually, climate change, how it affects us and what is actually going on, but also, the tools and the ideas, how to speak to others. And it's really important that you understand, and Rukiya has pointed it out repeatedly, that you understand the mechanisms and the dynamics that really shape a particular issue. You mentioned finance several times here. And I think there is unfortunately no shortcut, and there are different roles to be played. I think for journalists, for media, is really keeping the spotlight on the issue that really matters and the issues that are really relevant. Now, this already is a big ask, because obviously in a time and age where every morsel of information is blasted out of proportion through social media, to stay sort of like focused on the stories that really matter is a challenge for any journalist, and in particular for media that are under pressure in many countries for financial reasons, and in many countries for political reasons, actually. Let's not forget that environmental journalism is one of the most dangerous forms of journalism in many countries. So, the media and journalists have, the obligation to first of all figure out what really matters, and then keep the spotlight on that and the Green Deal and what's going on there then on a national level as well is a prime example for that. Now, for the wider public, again, there are different ways of approaching that. Obviously, Rukiya also has mentioned several times now the sort of engagement of people who really are into the issue and try to find ways of speaking to their communities, to their audiences. And the civil society has a much bigger role to play, I think, on the key defining issues. And that brings in education and, being, you need to build up that capacity in civil society, but everywhere actually in society, to look into these issues. Is there an easy way? No. I mean, am I hopeful that we still, develop these tools? Yes, because, the awareness that the Fridays for Future movement has created, on top of a very good, strong, solid research community. They've not for nothing pointed to the science in basically all their messages, provides a good sort of like ground for civic education to take the awareness that has been built by the campaigners and the solid research that's out there already, to create information offers for the wider public there. And on schools and universities, I think that's a different story altogether. Again, probably something where more can happen on sustainability. But it's certainly nothing that you're going to fix in sort of like with a flick of a switch. You need to, the awareness now is there, and now it's a good moment actually to build on that and talk to people, and then find out, what's their concern, and then you listen to them, and then you sort of try to adjust, the core elements of what is relevant and what matters to their level of understanding and their interests also. I think, it doesn't have to be boring.
So it's all about engaging with the people. Is yesterday we've heard from the people in the art and cultural space around it that they see three broad functions from it there. One was around documentation and creating awareness, creating transparency. The second one is to provide pressure, a spotlight, and disrupt the status quo. And then the third one was about translating it into a new narrative, into a new normal, into a new paradigm around it, embedding it in the institutions. And I think what I'm hearing from you is really is the invitation to all of our participants in the workshops later on as well, to really see what we can contribute on all those different levels there in order to provide that, first of all, common understanding, awareness, and get that sense of urgency through a spotlight and building the pressure, but then also working on the solutions around it there. And it will be all for us together coming forward. I would like to come to the questions being asked by the audience, and the top one is one towards Rukiya and Imme, and it's a tough one. Before the EU starts with the Green New Deal, should it actually not immediately stop all the detrimental exports of waste and excess production of meat? Quite a specific question. Any views on that, or is that difficult to answer?
Rukiya, do you want to start?
You can start and I can go after you.
You want me to start, right? Okay. Yeah. I think this excess production of meat, for example, that is obviously a matter of metrics. But I assume that what you mean is this meat production at large scale, which with negative effects on how you treat the animals and the imports of fodder and all that's connected with meat production and placing the European Union as an exporter of agricultural products. And I think that the expectation actually we as a Council of Sustainable Development of the European Common Agricultural Policy was exactly to strengthen environmental criteria, and which would then be a clear incentive and also a clear regulatory incentive for reducing meat production. I mean, in Germany, we have these meat producing areas in North Germany where we have serious problems with nitrate pollution of groundwater. And that is already against European law. Yeah, and Germany is breaking that. And so that clearly has to stop. And waste production, I understood that the initiative of the European Commission on plastics is exactly aiming at that, because they want to tax non-recyclable plastic production. That will affect package. I mean, that will affect package and non-recycling of package, so of waste packaging, and then that should have an effect on reducing plastic waste, but I'm not sure whether they also want to directly aim at waste export. Yeah, I'm sure that what they are aiming at is to reduce waste. And when you look at the communication or at the strategy on circular economy, it looks explicitly at packaging and it looks explicitly at plastics. So I think that this is clearly on mind of the European Commission, and it has to be followed up by member states, obviously.
Thanks a lot, Imme. Any views on it, Rukiya, before we come to the next question?
Yeah, I think Emma covered the whole thing. We didn't want to add anything more, but I think I'll just try to go back to what Emma mentioned at the beginning of the conference when she talked around how just specific objectives around social dimensions of social sustainable development haven't been really touched on specifically in the Green New Deal. And I think this is a big, it's big in terms of, yes, there's just recovery, yes, just circular economy, but specificity in what aspects of the circular economy they want to touch on will be a good thing to add on to into the strategic policies or documents of the Green New Deal. In terms of ways towards to the continents, yeah, most definitely there's a lot of dumping that's been happening to the African continent, not only from Europe, but even recently now, the US was trying to sign a trade deal with our country Kenya around having to export plastics into the country, and just if you know that Kenya has a policy of ban plastic or single-use plastic in the country. We do not use any single-use plastics in the country. So this trade deal was kind of a big wake-up call to the communities on the ground. So dumping is an issue that's been happening for a lot of years for Africa, whether from China or whatever people don't use in their continents normally comes into our countries, and we sell them in the markets and whatnot. So this is a issue that, yes, it's something we need to tackle. And like we said earlier, it's all about implementation and just step-by-step consultation with all the partners that are involved to make sure that this comes to fruition.
Great, thanks so much, Rukiya. The next question is directed to all of you, and it's about what are your concrete suggestions for the role of civic education to actually handle all those multiple crises that are going on at the moment. Yeah, we've got COVID, we've got climate, we've got a polarization of societies, and it's just a matter of time before the next crisis hits around it there. What actually is needed to build that resilience in societies to actually be able to cope with those multiple big inputs, that drives that competition for funds and all the other different areas. Any viewpoints? Mm-hmm. Who would like to go first? Imme?
I have a very short idea for that. I think we should civic education needs to explain why we speak about crisis, but a focus on attractive futures is very important for motivating. I think you need positive ideas about how the future, a different future should look like or could look like, so that we know why we engage. We do not only engage to avoid crisis. This is a negative narrative. I think that is very important. What do we not want to lose? Yeah, but also what do we have to gain? What makes life attractive when structures are reformed, and when I think that is also an important function of this type of education.
Thanks very much, Imme. Any views from Rukiya or from Sven?
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, I think I totally agree with Imme on that. I would have said, let's inform the broader public about solutions and not just about the problems. That's how I would put it, but that's an important element. The other element is, I think make a clear distinction and help people to understand where they personally can seriously make a difference and where it's actually not necessarily their job. So this is two elements, because too often we're like, oh, how can I save the climate? Well, yeah, that is one element, but you also need to understand what political dynamics are much more important. And Rukiya mentioned the fossil fuel industry, for instance. If you don't use plastic bags, you made a positive contribution, but the big deal is not your plastic bag. And that is something that civic education sometimes gets a bit too much into the sort of like, oh, how can I in my personal life, which is an important element of empowering people, but it needs to be put in perspective. Otherwise, you end up with the sort of like these tiny little things and polls showing that people think that to save the climate, we have to give up plastic bags, which is, interesting, but certainly not the fix.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sven. Any views from you, Rukiya, on this topic?
I'll just have to say plus. Imme and Sven covered that perfectly.
Yeah, and again, I think it also was a topic of yesterday's discussion between Maya Göpel and Grace, where they really said it's not about what we're losing, it's actually about what can we gain, what can actually is a purpose for us, and what is actually good enough, what is sufficient for us going into the future in order to give people a clear perspective. The next question is coming from Catherine, who asked, many companies stress that politicians are actually more reluctant to reform ecologically than they are. And she puts as a reference the climate conference by the Spiegel or the Boston Consulting Group on November 3. How to fix that? That actually the corporate sector is now running ahead and politicians are trailing behind. Is that a true perspective, or is there actually some truth in it? Imme?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on who you ask in the corporate sector, obviously. But I think that it is important to note that the corporate sector is not uniform. There are many companies who are building their case on explicitly on a green narrative, so to say, or on a green idea. But there are other, and that I think is a significant change. There are other companies who who are CO2 intensive, and who want to survive, and who know we need to engage now in changing our those parts of our production system that are so CO2 intensive. But for that, we need to have a clear idea. What is the time frame? What is the ambition? And let's be more ambitious now, because otherwise we'll maintain this lock into carbon intensive production processes. And I think these are growing, and there the perception is that it has not, this change is not yet clear to all those in politics and in parliaments who think they still have to defend economic interests, and these interests are changing. I think that is important.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Imme. Anyone of the other to comment on this?
If I can, one addition to what Imme just said, I completely agree. It always depends on who you ask and what their perspective is. I think companies, in the way they're run, that we don't have to always understand them as an ethical institution, which is good if they are, but actually that's not the drivers usually. They adjust to what their customers want, what the frameworks are. Obviously, they try to influence, politics, so the frameworks are good for them. But this is an interplay. What I would say, and in response to these questions, politicians, obviously have to answer a question that companies don't. Companies will tell you what they need as a framework to shift from doing something carbon intensive to something low carbon. And that usually entails regulation that's in their favor and money. And the politician has to answer the question, who's going to pay for that? And that is obviously making the politician's job a little bit harder than sometimes in a business to say, well, we're going to shift if you subsidize new steelmaking technologies, if you set a framework that is conducive to that, and if you save our jobs. So I would always say it's like, yes, I think there is a genuine shift in many companies to understand that, the new production methods will be probably low carbon, but they want a certain framework for that, and they obviously don't want to, pay from their shareholders' account, and that makes their job slightly easier in arguing for policies that will help them than for politicians in democracies, at least, that have to go to their voters and say, okay, we're going to subsidize low carbon steelmaking, or we're going to replace all coal-fired power plants with renewables and have to invest in that. So that I think is at least one explanation why sometimes politicians look more cautious these days on ambition on climate than businesses.
Yep, and it shows that some corporate actually see a huge benefit of actually creating a narrative and building their case around it there. Let's see how this dynamic works out. Unfortunately, our time is running up. We have many more interesting questions, so we try to feed them into the different workshops again that are happening soon. I would like to give each of you just one short final statement in terms of what is your wish, your guidance for the rest of our day and tomorrow for the conference, and already a big thank you for your wonderful contributions and sharing your insights. Imme, would you like to start with a short final statement or a wish for the audience? We can't hear. Now I hear your voice. Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity to actually listen to Rukiya and also Sven. That was very helpful for me also. I would have liked to learn more about African climate and coal debate actually. But I think to have this as a starting point for a discussion on what is the role now about public civic education, I think this is great. I hope it was helpful for the audience too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Imme, for joining us. Rukiya.
Thank you, Dak. I'll echo Emma's comment around. It was a pleasure to really have a chance to be in this panel with Emma and Sven. I learned quite a lot. And just like recently, when the last question you guys asked was really bringing me to around the issue around debts in our countries. Like in Africa, some of our countries have carried so much debt, and sometimes that puts leverage on the people on the creditors to make us take up investments that don't make sense in our countries. And I guess deals like this means that we're in a position to be with investors that are really going to be pushing the narrative around just transition, just recovery. I'm excited about the ongoing conferences that are coming up, and I love the fact that you brought up aspects around artists and how they bring the change to the world. It's amazing how you can just do a mural or do a song and it can bring such heavy messaging and make it very light for every single person to understand. And I guess that's a very key part about civic education, making that text or that conversation palatable to everyone who's going to be taking it in. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for joining us, Rukiya. And Sven, final words.
Well, thank you, first of all, Dirk, for the opportunity, and Imme and Rukiya for the really interesting and important insights, actually. And it just hammered home for me something that I feel particularly strongly about is that, for these big issues, we need to think across borders. We need to think in the interconnections, the interplay of international politics, policies, but also, the relations between people. And that's probably where the civic education part comes in, because, civic education should focus on these relevant interconnections as much as they do on what's going on locally, and take these perspectives in and, make it fun, make it interesting, make it relevant to ordinary to everybody, basically. And I think if the conference can come up with interesting ways to do that, I think that's a great first step. And then we need to keep going. And then, there's all reasons to be hopeful.
Just go and do it. Wonderful. Thanks so much to all of you. You're more than welcome to join any of our breakout sessions later on during the day and tomorrow. And I pass it over to Tanya to actually lead us into the next step.